In the heart of a divided America, where racial tensions ran thick like the humid air of the Deep South, a 14-year-old boy named George Stinney Jr. found himself thrust into the jaws of a merciless justice system, his fate sealed before he could even comprehend the weight of the accusation against him. And as the town of Alkaloo, South Carolina, stood as a silent witness, the wheels of a flawed and prejudiced system turned against him, orchestrating one of the most harrowing miscarriages of justice the nation had ever seen. But what if the truth was far more sinister? What if unseen hands had guided the course of events, concealing a hidden conspiracy buried beneath layers of deceit? And what if those who claimed to seek justice were, in fact, the very architects of the crime? As George, a frail and frightened boy, sat trembling in a dimly lit interrogation room, his wrists bound by cold metal, surrounded by men who saw not a child, but a scapegoat, a convenient resolution to a crime that had shaken their small town, a crime that had taken the lives of two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, their lifeless bodies found in a watery ditch, their skulls crushed with brutal force. And with no evidence but a forced confession extracted after hours of intimidation, George was sentenced to die in the electric chair, a verdict delivered in a courtroom where the color of his skin spoke louder than any words of defense. But what if someone knew the truth? What if there was a witness, a lone voice drowned in the cacophony of fear and prejudice? Someone who had seen a shadow slip through the woods that fateful day. Someone who had heard the whispered threats in the dead of night. A secret that, if revealed, could unravel the very fabric of the town's carefully constructed lie. And as the days crept towards George's execution, a desperate race against time began. A battle fought not in the halls of justice, but in the darkened alleys where secrets festered, where those who knew too much found themselves silenced before they could speak. And yet the truth had a way of clawing to the surface, even when buried under layers of deception, and as fear gripped the town. Whispers spread of those who had reason to see George condemned, powerful figures who would go to any lengths to protect their own. But could the truth be uncovered before it was too late? Before another innocent life was claimed by the system's relentless hand? And as the noose of injustice tightened, the clock ticked ever closer to the moment that would forever stain the pages of history, a moment of reckoning where the fate of one boy would become a symbol of a nation's deepest
failures.
And as time inched forward, the whispers of corruption grew louder, implicating powerful figures whose reach extended far beyond the borders of Alkaloo, weaving a web of deceit that stretched into the highest echelons of influence. And as George sat in his lonely cell, the weight of history pressed down upon his small frame, the echoes of thousands who had faced the same injustice before him. And yet, in the darkness, hope flickered. A secret investigation led by an unlikely ally, a journalist from a distant city who had stumbled upon inconsistencies too glaring to ignore. And with each turn of the page, each missing testimony, the case against George unraveled. But with the truth came danger, for those who had orchestrated his downfall would not stand idly by while their sins were exposed. And as the night before his execution loomed, shadows moved in the corridors of the prison, a final desperate attempt to silence the truth forever. And as George closed his eyes, awaiting the dawn of his final day, the town of Alkaloo stood at a crossroads, caught between the weight of its past and the possibility of redemption. But would the truth be enough to turn the tide? Or would it be buried, like so many before it, beneath the suffocating silence of history? As the night stretched on, an unexpected storm rolled over the small town, thunder rumbling like a warning from the heavens, lightning illuminating the cracks in the walls of Alkaloo's false justice. In his cold, damp cell, George flinched at every rumble, his young heart hammering as he thought of his mother, of his siblings, of the home he would never return to. Outside, the journalist who had begun to unravel the mystery sat in a dimly lit motel room, his desk scattered with old police reports, conflicting statements, and the few notes he had managed to gather from reluctant townsfolk. There were names that appeared too often, details that didn't align, powerful men with something to hide. He knew time was running out, But every door he knocked on slammed shut. Every truth he uncovered led to more questions, and the closer he got to understanding what really happened that fateful day, the more he felt eyes watching him from the shadows. Meanwhile, within the town's high society, where wealth and power dictated the course of justice, the real culprits sat in comfort, sipping whiskey, and sharing hushed conversations in smoke-filled rooms. They had been certain George's conviction would be swift, that no one would question a poor black boy's fate. But now, with whispers of doubt circulating, they found themselves tightening their grip, ensuring that no one dared dig too deep. A quiet warning was issued to the journalist. An anonymous note slipped under his motel door. Walk away before you can't. Yet, the journalist was not the only one seeking the truth. A woman, older now but haunted by memories of the past, had long known something wasn't right. She had seen Betty and Mary Emma talking to a stranger that day, a man the police conveniently never questioned. She had stayed silent, out of fear, out of self-preservation. But as the execution drew near, the weight of guilt pressed down on her chest. Could she bear to watch an innocent boy die knowing she held the key to the truth? And so, as the town slumbered uneasily, forces moved unseen, some working desperately to reveal the truth, others determined to bury it forever. The courthouse clock ticked mercilessly, each chime bringing George closer to his final moment, and yet, somewhere in the darkness, hope remained, flickering like a candle against the storm. But would it be enough? Or was George Stinney Jr. already doomed to be just another forgotten name? Another casualty of a system that had never been built for him to survive. And as the journalist made one last desperate phone call, a voice on the other end hesitated, then whispered, "Meet me at midnight." And so, as the storm raged on, two figures stepped into the shadows, one carrying the burden of truth, the other the weight of an entire town's darkest secret, unaware that they were being watched, that danger lurked just beyond the flickering streetlights, waiting, ready to strike before the truth could ever see the light of day. And as the night deepened, a series of events began unfolding in the quiet corners of the town, drawing more unsuspecting figures into the storm, each with their own part to play, each unaware that they were now part of something much larger than themselves. As the journalist pressed forward, each revelation pulling him deeper into a labyrinth of lies, the night became a battlefield between those who sought justice and those who thrived in the darkness, each moment bringing new dangers, new players stepping out from the shadows. And as the weight of history bore down, the fate of one boy became intertwined with the fate of a town. A story that refused to be silenced, a reckoning long overdue, the battle between truth and deception teetering on the edge of oblivion. And as dawn approached, the town of Alcolu braced for the inevitable, the secrets of the past clawing their way to the surface, demanding to be heard, demanding justice at long last. As the midnight hour struck, the journalist stepped cautiously through the rain-slicked streets of Alcolu, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear, the note in his pocket damp from his clenched grip, the words, "Meet me at midnight," echoing in his mind like a warning. And as he neared the meeting spot, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, a woman cloaked in secrecy, her face partially hidden beneath the hood of her coat, her hands trembling as she extended a crumpled letter toward him, whispering, "This will tell you everything." Her voice barely audible over the howling wind, and before he could ask her name, before he could press for more details, she turned and disappeared into the night, leaving him with a document that could change everything. But just as he unfolded the paper, headlights cut through the darkness, a black car speeding toward him, and he barely had time to leap into an alleyway before the tires screeched to a halt. Footsteps echoing as men in suits stepped out, their eyes scanning the streets, their presence exuding a dangerous authority. And he knew, without a doubt, that he had come too close to the truth, that someone was willing to kill to keep this secret buried. And as he clutched the letter against his chest, he knew he had a choice to make. Run and save himself, or fight for justice, even if it meant his own life. And deep in the prison, George sat awake, his frail body curled on the hard cot, his mind racing with prayers and memories. And just beyond the iron bars, the guards spoke, in hushed tones, their laughter laced with cruelty, betting on whether the boy would cry when they strapped him into the chair, their indifference slicing through the cold air like a blade. But unbeknownst to them, wheels were turning outside. Those walls, forces converging in the dead of night, the journalist rushing back to his motel room, his hands shaking as he read the letter under the dim light, his breath hitching as he realized the depth of the conspiracy. For it wasn't just a case of wrongful accusation. It was murder, premeditated and covered up by the most powerful men in town, and the names written in ink were the very names that controlled the courts, the police, and the press. And now, he was the only one who could expose them. But as the clock ticked closer to dawn, his phone rang, the voice on the other end low and urgent. "They know you have it. You need to leave now." And at that moment, the motel door rattled, the lock twisting violently, and with no other option, he grabbed the letter, shoved it into his coat, and jumped out the back window, his feet hitting the wet pavement as he took off into the night. And as the town slept, unaware of the battle unfolding in the shadows, George's mother sat by the window of her small home, her hands clasped in silent prayer, tears streaking down her face as she whispered his name, begging for a miracle, for someone to see her son as the child he was, not the monster they painted him to be. And miles away, in a grand estate on the outskirts of town, the true murderers sat in comfort, their glasses clinking in quiet celebration, certain that by sunrise all loose ends would be tied. But what they didn't know was that the journalist wasn't alone, that an underground network had taken an interest in George's case, men and women who had seen too many innocent lives destroyed. And as the storm raged on, the resistance grew stronger, whispers spreading like wildfire. And when the sun finally rose over Alcolu, the town was no longer the same, for the truth had begun to leak, whispers turning into shouts, protests brewing outside the courthouse, the execution hour looming as the final battle for justice reached its peak. But would it be enough? Would the voices of the righteous be heard over the weight of corruption? Or was George Stinney Jr. doomed to meet the fate so cruelly decided for him? And as the final moments approached, as the guards came for the boy, as the crowd outside reached a fever pitch, the journalist made his last desperate move, breaking into the radio station, hijacking the airwaves, reading the names aloud, exposing the truth for the entire world to hear. And in that moment, the town of Alcolu stood still, the air thick. With tension, the execution chamber prepared. But for the first time, the question was no longer whether George Stinney was guilty, but whether America was ready to confront its own sins. And as the final second ticked away, the answer lay in the hands of a nation on the brink of change, a reckoning centuries in the making. And whether justice would prevail or be drowned in the tide of history remained a question only the morning would answer. But the battle had only just begun. For as the broadcast reached homes far beyond Alcolu, journalists across the country took notice, their pens poised to unravel the corruption that had festered beneath the town's surface for decades. And within hours, the governor's office was flooded with calls, the pressure mounting as the world demanded justice. And inside the prison walls, George could feel the shift in the air, the guards now eyeing each other with uncertainty, whispers of a possible intervention spreading like wildfire. And outside, the streets were filled with people, their voices rising in unison, demanding a stay of execution. And as the hands of the clock inched closer to the appointed hour, a convoy of black cars tore through the streets, the governor's special envoy racing against time, clutching a document that could put an end to the nightmare. But inside the prison, the execution chamber was being prepped, the warden pacing anxiously as the phone on the wall remained silent. And George, despite the overwhelming fear clawing at his chest, refused to let them see him break, his back straight, his gaze unwavering as the guards led him forward. And just as the final switch was about to be pulled, the doors burst open, a frantic official waving the governor's order in the air, and the room fell into stunned silence. But the battle was far from over, for the men who orchestrated this injustice were not about to let their sins come to light so easily. And as George took his first steps back into the world, he knew that the fight for the truth had only just begun, and the storm that had been brewing in Alcaloo was now ready to sweep across the nation, unraveling a web of lies that had ensnared not just him, but countless others who had been silenced by the weight of a broken system. And as he stepped into the blinding light of freedom, the journalist stood waiting, the letter clutched in his hand, knowing that this was just the beginning of a war that would shake the foundations of power itself. And with every name exposed, with every truth unearthed, the battle for justice surged forward, an unstoppable force that no amount of corruption could silence. And as the echoes of George's footsteps faded into history, his story became more than a tragedy. It became a revolution, a testament to the resilience of truth, and a warning to those who thought they could bury justice forever.